Hello, good morning, Mr. Discuter.
Morning.
Welcome everyone. So I'll briefly present myself. So my name is Valentin Bader. I am the director in charge of, the vice president, sorry, in charge of seminars and conferences of ELSA Belgium. Um, we would like first to thank ELSA Germany for this project. It's always nice to have a big cooperation like this, and especially like for such a challenge. So just briefly, before Matthias gives a brief introduction on the topic, I will introduce you to our speaker today, which is Mr. Olivier de Scuter, who is a professor of international human rights law and EU law at the University of Louvain in Belgium, as well as professor at the College of Europe. Mr. de Scuter has also served at the United Nations as a special rapporteur on the right to food from 2008 till 2014. He has been a member of the United Nations Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights from 2015 till 2020. And he has, since the 1st of May 2020, has been appointed as United Nations Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty, which is the topic that interests us today. So without any further ado, I will pass the floor to Matthias, who will give just a brief introduction, and then it will be the floor will be yours, Mr. Discuter.
Hello, do you hear me? Yeah. Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. I'm Matthias Bibo from ELSA Belgium. Thank you, Mr. De Schutter, who does us the honor today of speaking on the issue. As you may or not know, no poverty is the first of 70 goals from the United Nations. Eradicating poverty in all its forms remains one of the greatest challenges facing humanity. While the number of people living in extreme poverty dropped by more than half between 1990 and 2015, too many are still struggling for the most basic human needs. We consider that to live with less than $1.90 is extreme poverty. As a matter of fact, more than 700 million people still live in extreme poverty. 80% of these people live in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. Some 1.3 billion people live in multidimensional poverty, half under 18. Since 2010, the world was off track to end poverty, but then the crisis happened, missing the target of ending poverty. COVID-19 causes the first increase in global poverty in decades. The virus threatens global effort to tackle poverty and inequality, including gender inequality. More than 71 million people are pushed into extreme poverty this year, according to the data of the United Nations. The pessimistic forecast of the World Bank Group raised this number of more than 100 million of people. For now, the three most affected countries are India, Nigeria, and Democratic Republic of Congo. Strong social protection systems are essential for mitigating the effects and preventing many people from falling into poverty. Nevertheless, 55% of the world's population, about 4 billion people, did not benefit from any form of social protection in 2016. Why is there so much poverty in the world? Poverty has many dimensions, but its causes included unemployment, social exclusion, and high vulnerability of certain populations to disasters, disease, and other phenomena which prevent them from being productive. Beyond its economic impact of unprecedented magnitude, pandemic and health containment measures have exposed the population to problematic living conditions and exacerbated pre-existing social inequalities. And I'm only talking about poverty in the first sense. Unfortunately, many indirect problems are to be deployed. Impact for the excess of health, care, food, justice, or just having a dignified life. As an anecdote, just remind that the International Day for the Eradicating of Poverty is October 17. 1 month later, here we are. Now, I will leave the floor to the Professor De Schutter to elaborate and present you further the topic of no poverty. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, Matthias and Valentin, for allowing me to say a few words about the question of extreme poverty and its relationship to human rights. And let me start by noting that despite all these figures that Matthias has provided us, I still, with many others, am extremely skeptic about the progress that we have achieved. Matthias mentions the official figures, which is that we have made significant progress since 1990 in tackling the issue of poverty. Since in 1990, the estimate was that we were about 1.9 billion people in poverty in the world, representing 36% of the global population, whereas by 2015, we would be about 736 million people in extreme poverty in the world, representing about 10% of the world's population. That is the official narrative. It's a narrative of success and of achievement. And the problem is, it's just a lie. The reality is that these figures are based on a measure of poverty that is entirely unrealistic. This measure is the World Bank International Poverty Line of $1.90 per day per person in parity of purchasing power. In other terms, you have to translate this figure from state to state, depending on the costs of living in each country. And to give you an idea, the benchmark of $1.90 per day in parity of purchasing power means 1.41 euros per day in a country such as Portugal today in 2020. Now, I ask you, how possible is it to live with just about 1.41 euros per day in Portugal, 45 euros per month? This is entirely unrealistic. You cannot survive on 50 or 60 euros per month in a country such as Portugal. So the measure of extreme poverty is just ridiculous. And it is actually not reflecting the reality of the problem, the amplitude of the problem of extreme poverty in the world of today with growing inequalities. Moreover, this success story, right, moving from 1.9 billion people in poverty in 1990 to 736 million in 2015, is based on, for the most part, success in one single country, China. Remove China from the map, and we actually have an increase in the absolute number of people in poverty, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa and in the Middle East. So unfortunately, it still is a huge problem. The progress we have made is very insufficient and very less spectacular than what Matthias has described using the official UN figures. So it's absolutely not Matthias that is here being criticized. It is the way these figures are collected and what they actually mean. So the crisis we are now in, the worst crisis we have since the Great Depression of 1929, is a unique opportunity to replace the question of poverty at the top of the political agenda. And indeed, we have seen over the past 6 months, governments invest massive amounts in the economy to restart the economy and to protect corporations from bankruptcy, and indeed to protect workers and populations. Some 12,000 billion US dollars have been injected in the economy for that purpose. However, a very small portion of this goes to supporting people in poverty by social protection measures. About 590 billion US dollars, in other terms, about 1/20th of the total sums that governments have injected in the economy go to social protection measures. And across the world, it is true that we have a quite significant number of social protection measures that have been adopted. The last count we have is that about 1,400 social protection measures had been adopted. In other terms, countries have invested in social protection to a significant extent. The problem, however, is that many of these measures are short-term measures and do not provide predictable long-term support to people in need. Very often, these measures have been adopted for the time of the lockdowns. And these measures are now going to be phased out so that the worst impacts on poverty will be felt probably at the start of 2021, in the course of next year. And we will probably witness an increase in the number of people in extreme poverty that will probably be around 176, 180 million more people in extreme poverty. So this is going to significantly increase the number of people in poverty, erasing the results of 10, 15 years of progress in combating poverty. Moreover, many of the measures adopted shall not actually reach the people in need. I'm thinking, first of all, of the large number of people in the informal sector of the economy or in precarious forms of employment. People in the informal sector represent some 1.6 billion people working in the informal sector, and people in precarious employment are about 400 million in the world. So altogether, 2 billion people working in the informal sector or in precarious forms of employment are not benefiting today from social protection, and many of them have not been covered by the social protection measures that have been adopted in recent months. Migrant workers, undocumented migrants in particular, have often been excluded. Indigenous peoples have often been excluded. And moreover, and perhaps even more worryingly for me, as Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty, I'm struck by the fact that many people in extreme poverty shall not benefit from the social protection measures that have been adopted. Why? Because there are many administrative obstacles to claim the benefits these people normally should have a right to, because these people cannot provide the documentation required, for example, because they're homeless, because many of the benefits must be claimed by filling in forms online, and many people have no internet access. UNICEF has reported that in 71 countries, more than half of the population has no internet access at all. And of course, people in poverty have least internet access in comparison to the rest of the population. In some countries, a very small number of people in poverty has an ability to fill in these forms online because of their lack of digital literacy. So unfortunately, although we have the impression that countries are doing a lot, that governments have reinvested significantly in social protection as a result of the crisis, I believe that there still are many gaps in the system and that we must move much faster to strengthening social protection floors for the benefit of populations. Now, governments have committed to do this when they adopted in 2012 a recommendation under the umbrella of the International Labour Organization, the ILO. In 2012, recommendation number 202 was adopted on national social protection floors. And this recommendation was unanimously adopted by the International Labour Conference, in which governments have committed unanimously to protect all individuals, men, women, and children, throughout their lives by a basic set of protections providing income security, from cradle to grave, from child allowances and maternity benefits to old age pension, and including unemployment benefits, healthcare benefits, disability benefits, and all the social protection floors that allow individuals to be protected throughout their lives by basic income security. And what's really important to emphasize is that Recommendation 202, adopted in 2012, adopts a rights-based approach, stating very clearly that the social protection floors should be stipulated in domestic legislation, should provide individuals with entitlements they may claim before independent bodies, investing them with rights that they may claim the benefit of. So it's something else than the cash transfers that have been decided, improvised ad hoc during the crisis, that are based not on rights and duties, but on a concept of charity of the government towards the population. So developing or designing social protection measures using a human rights-based approach, stating that social protection floors are simply reflecting the human right to social security is extremely important for three reasons. First, basing social protection on human rights is a way to redefine the relationship between the service providers on the one hand and the beneficiaries on the other hand. Service providers become duty bearers and the beneficiaries become rights holders. And they have a right to claim the rights they have a right to against the service providers. This is important because it removes the stigma, the shame of claiming benefits, because it reduces the risk of corruption, because it reduces the risk of discrimination in the way the benefits are allocated. And so for all these reasons, the relationship between service providers and beneficiaries is transformed once you use a human rights-based approach. Secondly, very often in the language of human rights, the right to social security, the right to social protection is seen as the end result of a development process. The idea in some is that countries should develop their economy, should grow, and at the end of the development process, perhaps they shall be able to afford providing social protection floors to their populations. Well, I challenge this view. I believe that the right to social protection should be guaranteed from the start of the development process to ensure that development is more inclusive, that any growth, any development benefits people that are at the bottom of the social ladder, and that growth is therefore much more inclusive. And it should be seen as an ingredient of growth, social protection, not as the end result of an economic process. That is the best way to ensure that we develop economies in a way that is sustainable and sufficiently widely spread across the population. The third reason why using a human rights-based approach is important in designing social protection for the population is because it ensures that people shall participate in designing, in implementing, and in monitoring or assessing social protection measures. That is really important. Why? Because people in poverty very often have been excluded from decision-making, and their economic marginalization has led to political disempowerment. And conversely, it's because they've been excluded from decision-making that economic policies have not benefited them. So the participation of people in poverty is extremely important to ensure that the progress made is not reversed and that governments are held accountable to the population in need. Moreover, if people in poverty participate in designing the measures, in implementing them, and in evaluating them, it would ensure that the qualitative dimensions of social protection are not omitted. It's very important that we understand that social protection measures can have blind spots, can be mistargeted, can leave out certain individuals, for example, the homeless, the undocumented migrants, people in extreme poverty who cannot fill in the forms online that I described earlier. And so ensuring the participation of people in poverty is a way to make sure that the services that are meant to benefit from shall effectively reach them, and that if some people are left out, the policymakers shall be alerted to this. So this is why I'm trying to convince governments to adopt rights-based social protection measures. This crisis is an opportunity to draw the attention of governments to the fact that there are still many gaps in the system and that we can do better and that we must do better in order to build more resilient societies for the future. Thank you very much, and I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you, Mr. De Scooter. I don't know if we already have any questions from the participants, but like in my mind, I had a question because you mentioned the fact that administrative issues constitute a huge thing to face the social protection, and that there's a lot of people who cannot access that social protection because of those administrative complexities. How do you think that the political sphere could work to improve that?
Thank you. I think this is an important question, and the answer is that for many years, social protection was seen as having to be targeted towards people in poverty and facing extreme destitution. And the reason why such targeting was recommended was because it was considered to be the most efficient use of scarce public resources, right? So to make sure you would really address poverty in the most economical way possible without increasing public deficits too much, targeting was seen as the best solution. And as a result, in order to benefit from certain social protection measures, you need to fill in forms to prove that you have too little income, to prove that you've not been working in the informal sector and thus receiving revenue and so on. And the administrative hurdles, the complexity is really the result of this suspicion and this obsession with strict targeting. Now, unfortunately, targeting has proven to be extremely problematic. In many cases, people in poverty have been excluded from the system as a result of this targeting because they cannot provide the documentation, because they cannot pass all these administrative hurdles. And so what we need to do is move towards more universal schemes that all people can benefit from at minimal conditions in order to reduce the administrative hurdles. That is also the best way to ensure that the middle class in countries support social protection that benefit the poor. And I have to explain this because in some countries, you see, the middle class perceives social protection as not benefiting them, but benefiting only people in extreme poverty. And social protection, welfare policies are seen as taking from the wealthy individuals, the wealthy families, to redistribute to people in poverty. And so these are not very popular policies. Instead, if you have much more universal schemes, as we have for education, for healthcare in many countries, and as we have for unemployment benefits, for example, if you have universal protection benefiting a large part of the population, protecting all people from the risks of existence, you will have much more popular support, and you can have much less stringent requirements with all the risks of under-inclusion that such strict requirements may lead to.
Thank you. I have a personal question. I present a review of the current situation with the official figure of the United Nations, but why the UN have presented such a positive situation if, in fact, the reality is quite different?
Well, this has to do with the way the World Bank defined what extreme poverty is back in the 1990s. What the World Bank decided to do is to ask 6 low-income countries, right, part of the poorest countries on earth, to define their national poverty line. So I forgot which countries these were, but probably, maybe Malawi, Madagascar, very poor countries. And these countries not willing to admit that 80% of the population was in extreme poverty used a very, very low figure. And what the World Bank did was very simply, well, look, if 6 very poor countries tell us this is their poverty baseline, let's use this as the international baseline. But it gives a ridiculous result, you know. Again, according to this figure, if in Portugal you have more than 45 euros per month, you are not considered poor. I mean, that's ridiculous. And that is why I encourage governments to use a different measure of poverty, which is a relative measure. You are poor, I would submit, if your revenue is below 60% of the median income within your country. Because even if you still have an ability to have a shelter, a roof above your head, and even if you do not starve, but you are much poorer than the rest of the population, you will feel excluded, you will feel marginalized, you will feel shameful, and you will not be able to be integrated within society, not able to basically match with others. And so that is the feeling of poverty that people, even in Norway and Sweden, experience if they are part of the poorest groups of the population.
To jump back like on the United Nations, do you think that the work that is done by the United Nations is something that is currently efficient, or how could such organs like the General Assembly or maybe the Security Council, especially in the current time of health crisis, can try to work on ensuring that the actions that are taken by the United Nations are really put in place and help to fight the poverty in the world?
Thank you. I think we are not imaginative enough in how we address poverty. And I'd like to explain this. The classic way of addressing poverty has been, since the Second World War, even before that, to grow the economy, stimulating economic growth, and then you tax the wealthiest groups and you tax corporations, and with the revenue you collect from taxation, you redistribute by social policies, right? So the fight against poverty was based on post-market compensation for the poor. But that poses a number of problems. First, it depends on economic growth. And economic growth is not realistic anymore. Many countries shall never be able to grow again as they were able to grow in the 1950s and 1960s. Secondly, growth is very problematic because of the ecological footprint it results in, the environmental damage caused by economic growth. And thirdly, in the name of growth, we've adopted a series of policies, the deregulation of labor markets, trade liberalization, the provision of tax holidays to companies to attract investors, and so on, a series of policies that in fact have created exclusion, not inclusion. So we have a system in which the market excludes and in which we then compensate for those exclusions by social policies and progressive taxation. And I think that is not satisfactory. I think we must also work on pre-market inclusion processes. In other terms, not only work post-market. And pre-market inclusion processes means reshaping the markets in order to ensure that they include people, that they recognize the competence, the talents of all individuals, including in particular people in poverty who are very inventive and innovative, provided they're given a chance. And we must do this by using a series of tools such as the social and solidarity economy, such as the provision of microcredit and microfinance, such as the creation of jobs for people in long-term unemployment by creating companies that have that as their social purpose, not to create profits for shareholders, but to create jobs and to create opportunities for people in long-term unemployment. We can be much more imaginative, and we must redefine how the market functions rather than just compensate for the damage caused by the way markets have been functioning to date. And I think the UN should really use its ability to stimulate this imagination, and it can do so by comparing countries with one another. Look, the UN has no tool it can impose on countries to do certain things, but the UN can rank countries, can compare experiences, can benchmark countries against one another. That is what modestly I'm trying to do in my mandate as Special Rapporteur on extreme poverty. And it is really the only way to go, to broaden our set of tools, our toolbox to combat poverty.
I have one more question. The business can influence the market, the business economy, but all people, what are the concrete measures that people can take without making any reference to the international politics, but concrete individuals' actions to decrease poverty, or business or firm or?
Well, I'm actually working on this. As you may know, in 2011, the Human Rights Council, which is a 47 members large intergovernmental body in Geneva, part of the UN system, the Human Rights Council adopted the guiding principles on business and human rights, essentially stating that all companies should respect human rights and governments should impose on them to respect human rights. What is striking is that these guiding principles said nothing about the contribution that the business sector should make to combating poverty. And I intend to make proposals on this particular issue because I believe that if companies pay a decent wage to workers and go beyond the minimum wage set in domestic legislation where that minimum wage is insufficient, if companies pledge to reduce the gap between the highest incomes in the company, right, those of the CEO, and the lowest salaries paid, to reduce the gap, if companies pledge to work with local communities in the places where they invest to recruit long-term unemployed people and train them so that they have access to employment, I believe companies can do much more to reduce poverty. But for the moment, the expectation addressed to companies is that they maximize profit for the shareholders' benefits. And unfortunately, that leads companies to pay low wages, to put workers at work in global production processes where the wages are lowest and where the unions are repressed or not defending workers' rights effectively. And companies are encouraged, in fact, not to pay taxes where they make their profits, but instead to declare their profits in tax havens. This is a huge loss for public revenue across the world. And so there are many things that companies should be expected to do that can help to tackle poverty. And that is indeed a part of what I'm working on. And I believe we could really leverage the business sector to address poverty much more effectively.
Thank you very much. I think that we have questions from the audience as well. So yeah. So I'll read the first question. So the first question is, in many other sustainable development goals, is it easy to get active personally? Well, the person is having difficulties to find those opportunities in the goal number one, which is no poverty. Do you have any tips on an individual person can achieve for this person? No poverty.
Yeah, it's a good question. I never thought this, but I think it's true. It's true that it's difficult to make a difference at the individual level, although you can do this in other areas to some extent by the way you consume energy, by the way you consume food, and so on. I do think, however, that what certainly can be done is to encourage a change in the way poverty is framed and described in public discourse. In many cases, people in poverty are shamed. They are considered to have the wrong qualifications, not to seize the opportunities, to have made the wrong choices in life. And as a result, people in poverty are shamed, they're stigmatized, they therefore may not dare to claim the benefits they have normally a right to, and so on, and they're discouraged. They are punished, penalized in some cases. And I think we all should change our view of poverty. Poverty is not the fault of the individual. It is a failure of society that has not been able to be inclusive enough, not been able to give to each individual his or her fair chance, not able to integrate people as it should. So I think at our modest individual level, let us speak about poverty differently. Let us see this as a collective responsibility, not as an individual responsibility.
Thank you. The next question is, do you think that poverty is handled adequately in Belgium, and what can be improved?
Look, it's very difficult because most of the issues related to poverty in Belgium should be treated differently depending on in which region you are. We have some figures about poverty in Belgium that show how much poorer people are in the region of Brussels. And the Walloon region comes next. And in the northern part of the country, in the Flemish part of the country, the situation is not quite as bad. So there are important differences between the regions, but there is a serious problem of poverty in the region of Brussels, particularly amongst single-parent families, and particularly in some communities that are recently immigrated populations. So it is there that we must strengthen our efforts. I think the key thing is to invest more in early childhood, because many studies show that the more we invest in the child's education and care during early childhood, in other terms, during the first 3 years of the child's life, the greatest results we can achieve. Investing in early childhood to mitigate the impacts of children being born in poverty is the best investment a society can make. So I believe that if there's any priority we should give ourselves in Belgium, it would be to increase the levels of investment in early childhood.
So the next question is, so with your background, as I mentioned, as a special reporter on the right to food, where do you see connections between how countries need to get active to enable the right for food and end of poverty?
Thanks. This is in fact a very complex question. The reason being that for 60 years, perhaps, since the Second World War, many agri-food policies, agricultural policies and food policies, aimed at reducing the cost of food for families. And the low-cost food was encouraged as a solution to ensure that food would be affordable for all. But that is very problematic. First, because it resulted in investing in food production that was entirely unsustainable from the environmental point of view. And secondly, because it resulted in diets within populations that made people unhealthy. And today we have a very significant increase in the rates of overweight and obesity, largely the result of people eating processed foods. And we have a large number of people victims of non-communicable diseases linked to unhealthy foods, leading to heart disease, leading to cancers, leading to diabetes. And who are the most affected? Well, mostly people in poverty, right? In families with relatively low income that therefore do not afford the best quality foods and the most diverse diets, but that buy low-cost food options and as a result become sick. So I think low-cost food is not the solution, it is the problem. And what we need to do is to ensure that diverse and high-quality diets are affordable to all. That means taxing junk food and heavily subsidizing fruits, vegetables, and food options that rely on fresh foods that are minimally processed in order to ensure that eating healthily is not a privilege of the few, but is democratized and affordable for all the population. But I do think that the debate between anti-poverty groups on the one hand and the groups in society working on healthy diets and on sustainable food production is sometimes a difficult one, because of course in the short term families in poverty depend on these low-cost food options. But I think it's a dead end, and I think we should really revise our priorities.
Thank you very much for this link between those two subjects. The next question is, why do you think that seeing social protection as an ingredient of growth and not as an achievement, I guess, is important to change the view we have on poverty?
Yes, it's important, I think, because often social protection is seen as a cost on public finance and as a luxury that poor countries cannot afford for their population. And very often in poor countries, governments say it's too early for us. We cannot, ensure access to unemployment benefits, to disability allowances, to old age pension, and so on. This is just too expensive for us. And yes, it is true that these governments should be helped. But by helping them, we are actually making an investment that can have very important returns for the next generation. Because social protection is a way to encourage people to invest in human capital, in education. It's a way to encourage parents to have fewer children, because if you are protected by social protection, if you are guaranteed an old age pension in particular, you will not need to have 6 or 7 children because you fear for your old age. You are protected by state policies. And moreover, if you have social protection, you will be encouraged to be an entrepreneur, to start a small business, because you can afford to take certain risks, because you know that you will be protected if indeed you face a crisis or your business plan fails. So I think social protection is really an ingredient of economic growth. It is an essential part of what sustainable development is, and it should not be seen as the end result of an economic process.
Thank you. So the last question from the audience, and then we will have one last question from our side. So do you think that it is contradicting to tax people that earn more than the needs to live and expect economic growth?
No, I don't think so. I think most people who innovate, who work, who create jobs by developing a new business, they do not do this to increase their wealth beyond certain levels. They are just stimulated by the prospect of creation and innovation itself. And we have many studies that show that when the marginal rate of taxation on the highest revenues that were, 80, 90% in the 1930s in the US, for example, right? Beyond a certain level, people were taxed 90% of their revenue because they were just very high earners. They did not work less. They did not stop working. They continued to be motivated by the desire to innovate and to be successful as entrepreneurs. So I don't think that is true. And we have many studies that show that higher rates of taxation on the highest revenues have not led to reduce the incentive to work.
Thank you for the answer. The World Bank proposed the measure poverty in the world with the purchasing power parity, as you said before, but it seems out of touch with reality. The choice of the 60th result in the result of a consensus within the European Union. You mentioned the median income. However, it seems a good alternative. Why the United Nations does not take this calculation method for the poverty in the world?
Well, that's a good question. The answer, however, is that the Sustainable Development Goal number 1 that is associated with this measure of poverty of $1.90 per day is not the only SDG. And we have another SDG on reducing inequality, which is number 10. And governments are meant to measure the progress of inequality or the reduction thereof by looking at the respective incomes of the 10% richest and the 40% poorest groups within the population. So there is a measure of inequality in the SDGs. And I think it would be good just to adopt a much more realistic measure of poverty that is relative rather than absolute. But that is in part compensated by SDG number 10.
Thank you very much, Mr. Discuter, for this very fruitful discussion, for your presentation as well, taking the time to be there and to present as well, because you also have an active role in the United Nations on that topic. So it was very interesting to see your view on that topic as well. I think that, yeah, Sophie is back with us.
Thank you.
So thank you so much once obviously to ELSA Belgium for organizing this really interesting panel, and then to you, Professor, for taking the time today and also responding to all of the questions that were asked. I think there were definitely some very thought-provoking ones, and obviously what we're trying to accomplish with this 24 Hours for Human Rights live stream is in a large part to educate and to sensibilize people to all of these topics. So I think this 1 hour slot has definitely gone a very long way in helping us accomplish that goal. So thank you very much, ELSA Belgium, and to you, Professor, for taking the time and for organizing this event.
Thank you very much. Then now, thank you very much also to Matthias, who else helped me with this panel and this lecture. And I will leave the floor back to you, Sophie, for the rest of your 24 hours challenge. So have a good day. And thank you, Professor.
Thank you, everyone. Have a nice day.